Over the last few months, the forward planning group of Presbytery have been taking some time to think together about what the future for the Church of Scotland might be in Mid Lothian and in East Lothian, beginning to do some planning for the future, but aware as we've done that we plan against a backdrop of a dropping number of ministers of Word and Sacrament. More than half of our ministers currently serving are due to retire within the next 10 years, and with the numbers coming in, we think that within that timescale there may be a 40% drop. That will depend on the number of ministers coming in, and at the moment we're doing some things nationally to see how that might be addressed. But what seems more certain is that we will begin to see a drop over the next 4 to 5 years of something like 25 to 30%. That's a significant drop, almost a third of our ministry. And as you can imagine, none of us feel particularly happy about that. As we look at that, we're aware that we could decide just to let things happen. Just to leave things and to see the strong survive and those who are not strong simply die. But we're aware that that's not the way that we function or should function as a Presbyterian church. Instead, we look out for each other and we take a responsibility not just for individual parishes, but for Christian witness to the whole of Presbytery. And how we begin to plan and take that forward is absolutely crucial. As a group, we've been looking seriously at 3 options which we believe are possibilities for us. One is to institute a major programme of unions and readjustments to match the number of full-time ministers that we have. A second option that we've been exploring is to have some churches functioning without a full-time minister. That's not been our pattern in the past, but it may need to be as we move ahead. The third option is even more radical, to do a radical overhaul and to move to a much smaller number of better resourced churches. As we looked at those options, we felt that going down the route of unions and readjustments brought with it so much pain that actually it would not be helpful for us, it would debilitate us, and we would spend all our time on that rather than looking at growth. And so we're not recommending that first option. The third option carries the same kind of things with it. Major discussions about what churches will remain open and which will be closed. Again, we felt that was not the preferred option, but instead have decided that we should run with option 2, and Presbytery said that was exactly right. Let's look to some churches functioning without a full-time minister. That may mean in the longer term that we end up with a few churches well-resourced with ministers, but alongside that we would also have others operating without paid ministers. We would not have closed them, but have found another way of functioning. If we were to do that, then that would mean that we would begin to plan to place ministers strategically across Presbytery, making sure there's a geographical spread. So not all the ministers in East Lothian, not all the ministers in Mid Lothian, or even in specific towns, but actually making sure there is a spread and ensuring that some of those are in rural areas. Secondly, we would look to develop new models of local leadership to help to lead local churches. Thirdly, alongside that geographical spread in making decisions, we would place ministers in congregations with strongest signs of healthy life and growth. Fourthly, we would look, if it's possible, to reduce ministry and mission allocations for congregations with no minister, so that those with ministers are not simply being subsidised by those without, but those without ministers have finance in order to look at staffing locally. And finally, when churches are no longer viable, we would want to look at options other than simply uniting them with another congregation or congregations. Now, my guess is that as you look down that list that you would have questions about all of those, but perhaps particularly these 2 key areas. What does local leadership look like if it doesn't look as it does at the moment? And what are the options open other than union? We believe that we need to take some time to explore these areas, and in some ways, until we begin to answer these, we will not be able to move forward. we need to at least have something mapped out for the journey before we begin the journey. Although some of it may have to be done on the way. We won't be able to answer all of the questions before we begin. New models then of local leadership to lead local churches. What might that look like? We might extend ordained local ministers and seek to appoint more of them. We might look to readers attached to local congregations. But we also believe that we will need to look to locally appointed lay leaders working with a small team in congregations. We need to take some time to look at these. We're simply saying there are possibilities and opportunities we need to explore. Secondly, the options for churches which are no longer viable to function. One of the possibilities would be that we partner them with a larger church who would provide support and oversight to them. One of the other options is that Presbytery takes on that role, and that guardianship of Presbytery becomes something which is much broader than it is just now, providing governance support to local congregations. As we discussed this at Presbytery, there were also three other things that were brought up during the discussion. One was the need for us to work with other denominations on creative solutions. Not to imagine that we should do this all on our own, but actually that we need to work in partnership with others. And that's something that we will be taking forward. Secondly, there was a question about sacraments in churches with no parish minister. How would the sacraments continue to be celebrated? One of the possibilities is simply having parish ministers from elsewhere come in and to be there for communion and there for baptism. One of the other options is to create more ordained local ministers, but to do so, we believe there would need to be relevant, flexible, fast-track training opportunities. The training we have at the moment puts many people off. That's not in our hands as a forward planning committee, but it is something that we believe needs to be explored. A more radical option, which would need to be considered by the church as a whole, is having designated elders who can administer the sacraments. These are simply possibilities that we can explore going forward. Finally, some questions were asked about training. One of those would be about bereavement support and leading funerals, and training lay people in order to do that. We've already begun to look at this in Trinent and are putting together a team of people there who will take funerals and provide bereavement support. We've already appointed a staff member who will begin to organise the training for that team. And we hope that from that we will learn things that we can take to others in Presbytery. In leading worship, the Church Education and Worship Committee of Presbytery are already looking at piloting a course with a number of people in rural parishes, in rural churches, who would like to be involved and who are gifted to be involved in leading worship. There are other approaches, and we've already emailed ministers saying, please share with us what you've already done, so that as we begin to talk about this together, we can learn from those who've been doing things well. Even having said all of that, you may feel very much like this young man here, absolutely petrified, unsure about what the future holds. Although if you know anything about this young man, you'll know that being left home alone was actually something that forced him to be creative, and perhaps as a church that's what we need to be as we move forward. Undoubtedly though, the Church of Scotland is in a time of transition. The future will not look like the past, and it is indeed a very disconcerting time, a time when the old certainties are no longer there. Don't be surprised by that. Don't be surprised by the feelings and emotions that are there for you and that you will experience amongst your people. William Bridges, who writes on managing transitions, says people expect to move straight from the old to the new. But this isn't a trip from one side of the street to another. It's a journey from one identity to another, and that kind of journey takes time. We are on a journey. But in that journey, we are not on our own. And it is important for us to make sure that we are there to support and encourage one another. But more than that, that we might look to God. In Psalm 23 and verse 4 it says, I may walk through valleys as dark as death, but I won't be afraid. You are with me. Your shepherd's rod makes me feel safe. The darkness of the valley is not changed, but God's presence brings security. And so we need to look to him and to trust in God for all that lies ahead. We are not on our own. William Bridges, in his book, talks about this part of the journey being the neutral zone, the time between two places of certainty, being like that time in the wilderness for God's people, a time of transition. Here's what he says. The neutral zone is not the wasted time of meaningless waiting and confusion that it sometimes seems to be. It's a time when reorientation and redefinition must take place, and people begin to understand that. It's the winter, during which the spring's new growth is taking shape under the earth. A time of reorientation, a time of redefinition. That is what we are in just now. But new growth is taking place, often unseen, often in ways that we don't understand, and yet we know that God is at work. And so we look to him for all that lies ahead. As we take forward these discussions, though, about what the shape of the future might be, we hope that you will engage with us in that process. As a Kirk Session, we have 3 questions that we hope that you will consider and provide feedback on. First of all, do you feel that Presbytery are pursuing the correct option? Some churches functioning without a full-time minister, rather than engaging in that route of lots of unions and links. What do you think? Secondly, what needs to be put in place or provided so that churches can function well without a parish minister? You might want to think of that in your own context. What would we need to be put in place or provided so that we could thrive as a church without a parish minister? Thirdly, what other questions or concerns would you want to see answered before Presbytery pursues the path being suggested? We can't answer every question, but what are the important things that we need to sort out at this stage before we begin this journey? We look forward to hearing your responses as we engage together in planning for the future.